就是在这里 head out。体温仪都没有用，那你也许被刺伤了。用那个网页发。你得走那边去，上河那边。你们两个都先行这几个。找到了。那我终于找到了，说不定是电脑比较好。没问题，我是录，所以早就开始了。
Okay, guys. Good evening. It's good to see you're all here because with all the rain today, it was sort of looking that was not going to happen. Actually, I drove on my motorbike to the university when there was a black rainstorm and it was a lot of water. So it's good that stopped a little bit and that we can be here. Today, we just take as much time as we need. We can be short or longer, doesn't matter so much. But today we're talking about a test. So what we're going to do is at least I will explain to you what the test is so that you know what to expect, right? Secondly, I will walk you through the text one more time and I'll just say what I think is important about it, which means that it's also important for you basically. And then I just want to stress that the test is not there to trick you guys, right? So I'm not here gonna ask all sorts of stupid questions or whatever. It's just about testing. Did you read the literature and do you know the main issues that are discussed in the literature, right? So I'll explain to you what I think are the main issues in these texts. And then thirdly, but we'll do that first, I think, you can ask, or second, you can ask questions yourself about anything of the literature that you want to discuss, right? One thing, we have been using all these discussion forums on Canvas, right, to post your discussion questions. I'm gonna make another discussion post, which is for questions regarding to the literature and the test if in the next 2 weeks you come across questions that you have and you discuss it with classmates but you don't know what the answer is, then post that question on the discussion forum, but also send me an email with the question, because I don't see the discussion forum so often. When I receive this question, I will answer the question, right? So, and then I do that on the discussion forum so that everybody can see it. So if there are answers or questions, do it there, okay? If you don't want people to know who asked the question, you can also only send the email to me, and then I will post the question without mentioning who asked the question, and then give the answer. That's also fine. Okay? So what are we doing today? These 3 things. We talk about the format of the test, the literature review. Oh yeah, and I wanted to say next week is a reading week, which means in the CDU lingo there's no meeting here. So next week is just to read the literature and study for the test. Okay? So the format of the test, first of all. The test is in week 8. It's on the 22nd of October and it's here, right? So basically, before you enter the room, I'll make a setup where there's exam papers here, and then when that's finished, you can come into the room. You're only allowed to turn the exam paper. It's not an exam, it's a test. You're only allowed to turn and start looking at the test paper when I say so. Okay? That means because everybody needs to sit down first. The test is a closed book test, so you cannot look at the literature. You're not allowed to have any papers on your desk, all that sort of nonsense. And because it's only a very short test, it's only 2 hours, so you cannot go to the toilet either. Right? It's just sort of basic logical. The test is part of coursework, which means that even if you do not have a good grade for the test, you can still pass the course. Right? If it's an exam in the end, then if you have a fail for the test, you have a fail for the course. But because it's part of the coursework, you can still offset your test score with the other coursework score, right? So that's good for you guys. The test is 40% of the mark, which means that's actually considerable. It's almost half. So if you do bad in the test, it's not so good for your grade, right? So doing good in the test, if you want to get a high grade, which I think you guys would prefer, then you need to do well in the test. Takes place here, closed book. Now the aim of the test is just to test your understanding of the literature. So if you read the text, you've read the text already one time to prepare. If you're going to read it again and study, and you listen to what I say is important, and you know the answers to those questions, right? Then you do well in the test. It's not. I'm not here to trick you guys. It's not going to be sneaky questions about details. It's just basic, the general knowledge of the test. So what does the test look like? There's one part, there's not different parts, and you need to answer all the questions, which means you cannot choose. I don't think you have, no, you're laughing but very often in CDU the test is 5 questions and you can choose 3 or something like that. Which is of course really nice when you study, because then you just study half and there will always be a question about what you've studied. In this case, there's just questions that I ask, you have to answer them. So if there's a question about a text that you haven't studied, you won't know the answer, right? So you just basically need to study everything. The test starts here the normal time, 6:30, and it's also till the end of the normal time, so it's 1 hour and 50 minutes total. One more thing about the test, if you miss the test, there will be an oral makeup. So just to be quick, then we'll just make an appointment as soon as possible after, when you're not sick anymore, we'll just meet in my office and I'll just ask you questions about the same literature. Why is this? Because it's fair to everybody. If you would get 2 or 3 weeks more, you could study 2 or 3 weeks more. That's of course nonsense. So if you can be sick, it can always happen, we don't hope so, but if you're sick, we'll do an oral makeup test. Okay? There's one part and it's 4 questions. Now I've written down one example question so that you get a feeling, and it's a question about a text that we're not reading. So it's from an old, before this test we were reading, so I can just give you this text. This is the sort of structure that you get. At the top there's a short text, which is referring part of the literature, So in her article, From Redistribution to Recognition, Dilemma of Justice in a Post-Socialist Age, that's the title of the text. Nancy Fraser, that's the author of the text, discusses social injustice in our current societies, right? So A, which two types of injustice does Fraser discern? Well, she makes a difference between recognition and redistribution, right? So the answer there is just recognition and redistribution. What is the core of each of these two types of injustices? Then you just describe recognition is about this and this and this. Redistribution is about this and this and this. Right? Why does Fraser argue that these types of injustice present a dilemma? Well, the reason is because Fraser in a text says that fixing one very often creates a problem for the other. So it's a dilemma because you need to balance between these two. That would be the answer. And how is discussion of injustice relevant for policy learning? Well, because when you want to learn in policy, very often if you improve one thing, the other thing goes worse. Think about the text of Susan Feinstein. She has these 3 criteria for social justice, and she says, we've discussed how you could use those criteria for social justice when you look at policies. And then, well, by just asking the questions, how about political inequality of this policy? What is the effect for economic inequality of this policy, and what is the effect for social inequality of this policy? So that's the answer would be there by judging the policy on these different criteria. So you check first of all, if this was about Susan Feinstein's text, then how is Susan Feinstein's discussion relevant for policy learning? Well, because you can focus on the 3 inequalities and then see how it works. That will be your answer. So it's quite to the point and quite practical, the questions, right? Provided, of course, that you learn, that you read the text and that you know what's in the text. You can, generally there will not be 4, there will probably be 3 smaller questions. So you get 4 questions with sort of 3 parts, so 12 parts in total. You've got 2 hours for it, meaning that you shouldn't take too long. And if you really start to write a long history of whatever in the first question, you don't have enough time for the last question. So you need to keep track of time a little bit. So this test is not about you showing as much as what you've learned, it's just about answering the question, right? So if you give a lot of information that doesn't have to do with the question, still you don't get a good grade. You just need to say what the question is, okay? And if you give a really long answer on the first question, probably you don't have time for the 4th question anymore, so you need to think about that a little bit. That's about the test. Any questions about the test? This is clear. It's going to be fun. So that's it. Basically, you come here, 4 questions of 3 parts, answer all the 4 questions, you're about the text. Now, I will make sure that the questions are spread over the different texts. So it could be that it's not 4 questions about 4 texts, but it could be about 2 texts that are related, so that you have to answer. So for instance, it could be a question about the text by Marsh and McConnell and by Feinstein. How do they both talk about policy success, or something like that, right? But I will try to cover a lot of the text that you read also. Okay, anything else about this? Otherwise we'll go to... Okay, if you come up with any questions or if anything is not clear, it's in 2 weeks, let me know, right? Sometimes you're studying together and you think, actually we don't know, or something is unclear, just send an email. Okay? Again, if you send an email with a question about the test, I will post that email without your name so that you don't have to worry that everybody knows which question you asked, but just the question plus the answer, because if you're not sure about it, probably other classmates are also not sure. That's in the discussion on Canvas, so I can suggest that everybody has a check 1 or 2 days before the test to see if there's any discussion there, because then probably there's some answers that you might want to see. Okay? Okay, then the literature review, there's 9 texts, right? First of all, does anybody have questions? Probably not yet. Again, if you come up with questions about the text when because you're going to study now, and then it's, of course, now you're not so sure, and then just before the test you think like, I'm not sure about this, send an email. I mean, I cannot promise if you send an email the day before the test, quite late, that I still see it in time for you, but I'll try. Plus, our test is in the evening, so probably on the Friday morning I can still have a look and answer a question. Okay? So, 9 texts. And we discussed them already sort of in detail, right? During the meetings. So the first text, it looks like this for me. It looks different on the slide, because then there's a whole drawing, but if you make a PDF, this is what you get. It's the text of The Guardian by Metcalfe. That's the text on neoliberalism. Now, for this text, this is basic information about neoliberalism, right? This gives a background of the development of neoliberalism. It says something about where it comes from. It says something about who were important. It discusses von Hayek. It discusses Keynes and the struggle between these two guys. It discusses that neoliberalism is not only something about less government, but it's also about something that's in ourselves, right? It's a mindset. So those are the main. There's not a lot in this text that you can actually expect questions on in that sense. So if there's a question about this, it will be at that general level. So it discusses, a question could be, the text discusses the development of neoliberalism as a confrontation between Keynes and Keynesianism and von Hayek's ideas about neoliberalism. What are these two ideas and how are they confronted? It would be that general. Okay? And anything else? There's not so much to say about this text because it's a journal introductory paper. Okay, the second text, Harvey. I just follow, I'll just also, this one. From managerialism to entrepreneurialism. Okay, so basically a big part of the core of the text is in the abstract. So study the abstract well, that's the first thing. Because in the abstract is the only place where, remember that Harvey says, urban governance used to be managerialist and now it's entrepreneurialist. But he only describes what's managerialist in the abstract, right? But you should obviously be able to say what is managerialism, what is entrepreneurialism, and how are they different. And managerialism and entrepreneurialism, of course, then if you answer, you have to stress that it's about governance strategies. So if you talk about municipal entrepreneurial strategies, these are strategies of a municipality. Now next what Harvey, I've said already the last time, in the introduction he says something about that there's something new growing, right? That there's some new attention now for different strategies that he calls entrepreneurial. That's quite introductory, so there won't be a question about that. And then the second section about conceptual issues, that's just really abstract, so you can strike that away because there won't be a question about those. But then in the third section, then he summarizes 4 strategies that are being used for entrepreneurial strategies, 4 options, 4 ways. Those you should be able to replicate. You should be able to name them and say what they are. So the first one is try to attract businesses, production, industry to your city. The second one is stimulate consumption, and with consumption, of course, consumers could be also from here, but especially from elsewhere, so that's especially stimulate tourism. The third one is attract head offices to your city, and the fourth one is try to get advantages from your central government, which in this case would be try to get advantages from Beijing. Because still, we said national governments still hand out make a lot of policies that could benefit you. Think about, we said then, when the Chinese government was developing the high-speed rail network, if they decide that that network will cross your city and have a station there, that's really good for your city. So that's in an entrepreneurial municipal government tries to get those sorts of benefits from the national government, right? Another example would be that for Hong Kong, certain tax situations at this moment are really important. So Hong Kong wants to keep that in place. Now, at this moment still, Hong Kong SAR government is deciding on that, but everybody knows that also central government has influence on these things. So trying to be allowed to keep those tax benefits. So for instance, the fact that there's no luxury tax in Hong Kong, that's a huge benefit for Hong Kong government, right? So those are the four, but then you have to be able to explain how you do those strategies. So for instance, if you just say, yeah, attract industries or factories or production houses to your city, how do you do that? Well, by giving them tax incentives, by giving them cheap land, by building good infrastructure so that the goods can go from the factory to the harbor, these sort of things, right? A last thing in the text of Harvey that's really important is Harvey also discusses later in his paper the downsides of entrepreneurialism. He says why he thinks it's bad. And this is mainly in quotes, but he's saying, I think, he's saying at least three things we talked about when we're talking. And on the slide in the lecture, those three quotes are also. He's saying, first of all, one of the problems, one of the downsides of entrepreneurial governments, they are basically very good for rich people and for companies, but they're not so good for poor people and for middle class people. That's one thing. Secondly, he's saying they are risky. And I think we talked about the Tokyo Olympics. Organizing Olympics is typically one of those strategies that governments can follow. But then in Tokyo, in Japan, you see that Tokyo government, Japan government have spent a lot of money, but then the outcome has not been so good because of COVID. That's an example of risk, right? So they're risky. And third of all, one of the biggest problem is they are also easily copied. So if you say I give you a tax incentive, then the next city also gives a tax incentive. Then you both don't have any benefits, and basically only your tax goes down, the income from tax. So it's a risky strategy. It's a strategy that's good for rich people, but then it's not even sure that long term it's going to change anything. So basically it results in a race to the bottom, they call this, through which governments around the world get less and less and less money, and businesses get more and more and more money. But in the end, for the competitive position, structurally doesn't really change. That's Harvey. So it's only a few things that are really crucial. Then the text by Margaret Meyer. This one. Whose city? So in the title it says whose city? From Ray Powell's critique of the Keynesian city to the contestations around neoliberal urbanism. Now here you have that pair of the Keynesian city and neoliberal urbanism work again. There was also a pair in the first text, remember? In the Guardian article, where they confronted von Hayek with Keynes. So this text first starts to describe how, what sort of, it's all about conflict and contest in the city. But the paper is arguing that the nature of these contests have changed. And it's very strongly about the European welfare state, and especially about the UK. So it's got a very strong UK perspective. So if you guys read this paper from the perspective of the history of cities here in Hong Kong, it sort of makes sense, because although not really, because the neoliberal Hong Kong still has a lot of elements of the welfare state. If you read it through the eyes of Chinese urbanization, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, it makes a lot of sense, but in a different way, because there was clearly a welfare state, and clearly a lot of that welfare statism has disappeared, and there's much more capitalism now, and also of the neoliberal sort. But still, the history of China is different. So you have to remember, this is a paper really about the UK. That's what you have to understand. Now, first, Margaret Meyer is talking about what sort of conflicts were there. She's saying the conflicts that were especially there in the welfare state, in the Keynesian welfare state, and that's the state that Ray Powell was writing about. Those were conflicts about the distribution of things. When you have a welfare state, it's the state that gives out things, right? It's the state that decides, do you get social housing or not? So there the conflicts were about access to those welfare state services. And there was especially criticism of discrimination, for instance, in those processes, of the unfairness of those processes. Next, what Margaret Meyer does in the paper, she discusses Neo-Liberalization. And she discusses Neo-Liberalization as using four dimensions, right? We discussed them quite in detail. And the four dimensions are focus on growth first, and that's on page 173. Next, adopting entrepreneurial forms of governance. That's what Harvey also says, of course. Next, intense privatization. And then fourth, on page 175, social polarization as a consequence. Those are characteristics of the neoliberal city. So what Margaret Meyer says is that social polarization is the effect of entrepreneurial governance strategies, and that's quite similar to what Harvey says. And therefore, she then describes polarization and contestation in the neoliberal city as a situation in which increasingly groups fight each other. So increasing conflict is a typical characteristic of neoliberal urbanism. And for Margaret Meyer, it's totally logical that around the world, if you look at the last since 2008, 2009, there is these enormous conflicts in cities around the world, again and again and again. And what she would argue is that's not only because of specific characteristics, but that has a structural background in neoliberalization. So the fact that there were conflicts in Tunisia was not only about the Tunisian government, but it was about neoliberalization. The conflicts in Spain and in Greece was not only being angry at Europe, but it was about neoliberalization and how that works. The conflicts here in Hong Kong were not only specifically about Hong Kong and China, but they were about neoliberalization and the consequences for people in the city. There's a structural background to these conflicts, would Margaret Meyer say. Just to be clear, that's not what I'm saying, that's what Margaret Meyer would be saying. And then what Margaret Meyer does lastly, she describes some of the characteristics, the nature of those conflicts nowadays. So she's saying it's both middle classes, different groups come together here. Middle class groups, autonomists, artists. So it's not one coherent group, it's very many groups that come together. Okay, that was 2 or 3. 3. The first one was only half. Okay, now we're in week 3 when we were talking about policy transfer, right? We read 2 texts in that week. The first text was from McKenna Ward, and this one was about when you look at transfer, it's both about movement and it's about place. That was this text. And then the second text was from Aiwa Ong. And Aiwa Ong spoke about the fact that transfer does not only go from the West to the developing world, but the transfer goes from everywhere to everywhere. Those were the 2 texts, right? So for the text of McKenna Ward, so in the title already, they stress these words relationality and territoriality, right? Territoriality as that what binds something, and relationality as the fact that something moves from somewhere to somewhere. You need to be able to explain those terms in the way that they use it, because the word relationality is used in hundreds of ways, and territoriality also. So you need to be able to explain what do they mean with those terms when they talk about policy transfer. And basically their whole paper is about the fact that if you look at urban governance, that urban governance doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's not just here in a city and the government is looking at the city, but it's actually around the world. City governments are busy with the same things, and they are lending things from each other all the time. They're taking stuff from each other. They're seeing things, they're learning from there, and they're bringing it here. So it's about policy transfer. So McKenna Ward are very clear that in policy transfer, there are transfer agents. That's a very important term that they use. So what are transfer agents? You should be able to say that. So also a question, if you get a question, who does policy transfer? Well, that's not, then I would, if you get a question like, well, who does policy transfer? I would just say that's not an easy question. There's very many difficult groups involved. So there's governments that do it, politicians, but there's also all sorts of transfer agents that want to do it. These can be consultants, they can be the people that came up with these policies, they can be gurus that like that approach, all sorts of people. So so basically in this paper you should be able to explain relationality, territoriality as terms. You should be able to explain how does policy transfer work, and the fact that they say that transfer agents are really important, that it's an organized process. It's not something only that's being determined by the quality of a policy. It's because somebody says it's a good policy and tells it to you. So you only know about the policy because somebody wants you to know about it. And next, they use two examples to look at this process and how it works. You should roughly understand those examples. You should understand how the BID, how is the BID, the Business Improvement District, how did it travel, how did it work, what happened? Of course, in terms of the points that they want to make. Freedom. Okay, the text by Iowa Ong. Now that's the most abstract, the vaguest of the text. I think if you read that, this is really a text. The first time that you read it, I think you don't even finish reading it, because after one page you think already like, what the hell? Like it's like, so you really, this is one, if you want to understand what's in it, you really need to put some extra energy into it, right? So I remembered that in the PowerPoint, I gave a lot of slides with arguments and the main line of argument of Iowa Ong, right? So I would definitely just look at those slides and just see where are those sentences in the text, so that you understand the elements in the text. That can really help you. But Iowa Ong, if you would have to say what is it generally, it's generally about who's learning from whom. If you think about transfer, it's about policy transfer, but especially she's criticizing the idea that how a city should be governed always comes from the West, that good ideas come from the West. And she's talking specifically about cities, but generally that's her point. Good things come from many places and are landing in many places. So if you look at the text from McKenna Ward, what's being transferred from where to where, it's not only going from the West to the rest of the world, it's going from everywhere to everywhere. So in that sense, she wants to decenter the West. And that's very useful for us guys. If you're gonna think about policy transfer, we're totally at the other side of the world. Why the fuck all the time, look at European examples and so on, if there's really good examples in Asia. That's the argument of Iowa Ong, basically. Now she makes that point by first criticizing two lines of argumentation that, in theory, that act like developments in the world go through set sort of patterns. In the meeting we talked about developmentalism as something that starts somewhere and then goes somewhere, as if it's always the same. The two approaches that she discusses are political economy or attention for capitalism, and the second one is attention for the subaltern or post-colonial theory. And the argument of Awa Ong is that both of these theories act like things are everywhere the same. So political economy will always, in a situation, look at a city, say, well, in a city there's different classes, and it's the bourgeois, the owning class, who will determine what's happening in that city. And if you want to understand what's happening, you have to look at who are the bourgeois, and they're doing it. So in Hong Kong, it's the economic elites that determine what happens. In Shanghai, it's the economic elite that determine what happens. So it explains all the developments only from these objectified developments in relation to capitalism. It doesn't have attention for variations, for other things that can be different. Post-colonial theory or theories of subalterns will always look at which groups are subjected in a city. And they're the ones that are suffering. And they're the ones that are being pushed away. Again, it's the same everywhere. The groups that we're talking about might be different, but the processes are seen as the same. As if there's one process that's taking place in every city in the same way. Now, instead, Wong says that you should have much more attention for what is locally characteristics for cities. In terms of McKenna Ward, she's stressing that you should look at territorialization, how specific things are bound in a place. Right? So, and then this is why she calls it worlding. Worlding is where cities, where practices in places take elements from elsewhere, make it part of themselves, but do it in specific ways. So the idea of globalization, that's sort of unilateral, that's the same process everywhere, right? Globalization, this city is global or not. There are standards, are you global or not? It's an absolute thing. You globalize, meaning you have more contact with the world outside. And globalization is seen as good for the economy. Worlding is different. Worlding is you take elements from everywhere and you put it into your system. But then there's different directions. We world in this direction, we world in that direction. Globalization has one direction, is more or less. Worlding is not more or less, worlding is different. So the term worlding helps to understand the difference in processes, the difference in aspects. So that's much more about territorialization. So for instance, I think I used the concept of building metros. Metros are being built around the world. But the way that these things function is very different. If you look in Bangkok, for instance, metros, there used to be not so many lines, but every exit that you would take from the metro, there would be motorcycle taxis, like enormous amounts. And that would help you to get from the metro to your home. Now, for this reason, because these motorcycles, they can drive quite far. So actually, the distance between train stations is quite big, but it still works as a metro system because the motorcycle taxi bring you home. In Tokyo, there are no motorcycle taxis. So in Tokyo, you need to walk from the station to your home. And there's a specific distance. People don't want to walk longer. It's something like 5 minutes or 7 minutes. So in Tokyo, the train stations are 10 minutes walk from each other, so that the furthest point is 5 minutes. So although they're both metro systems, and they've spread from elsewhere, the way that they work, the way that they function is totally different, because in Bangkok there's motorcycle taxis. Now, I think in some of the Chinese cities at least, you have the same. In Guangzhou, if you go to the end of train stations, metro stations, there's also motorcycle taxi guys. And they also bring you, so it depends, but in some inner city areas, not. Because then they're pushed away by police and so on. So it really depends. It's different again than in Bangkok. It's everywhere, and it's actually organized. So you can use the word worlding to understand, because that influences how this works as a practice, how useful it is. And then next, what does Ayo Ong does? She focuses on 3 processes in particular. And that she calls those worlding practices. Worlding practices are modeling, interreferencing, and new solidarities. You need to be able to mention those and then explain what they are. Now modeling, if you think about urban development, modeling is you make a model, and it's a sort of stamp. Like when you make a stamp, you put a stamp here, you put a stamp there. It's just you have the model, and you do it everywhere. So the metro actually is a model. But then the way that that model is being worlded in that place can be different. But the model is the metro. The same thing, I think we talked about the podium building in Hong Kong. That was then spread, especially in South China, where in a lot of cities there's podium buildings, right? That's a model. So you can come up with endless models. High rise itself has been a model. The collective farm is a model. So these are ideas that come from somewhere. And then the special economic zone is a very important model nowadays. But also the prison. I mean, why do prisons around the world look the same? Because they came up somewhere with the prison. And then they started to build it everywhere. Right? That's how this works. So those are models. Interreferencing is where when you talk about something, you refer to another situation, either as good or bad. So you don't want to be like Mumbai, meaning you don't want slums and disorganized streets and garbage, and that's a negative image, right? It doesn't matter if it's true actually. You want to be like Singapore. In Bangkok, the government keeps saying they want to get rid of street food, which is the most ridiculous thing there is, because street food in Bangkok is fantastic. But then the government doesn't like it because it's such a mess, and they want to look modern. They want to have it's this sort of, it's about imaging. We want to be a modern city, so we want to be like Singapore. Would be really bad, but. So this is what happens a lot. Cities and mayors use examples that they've seen somewhere else. And it's not only it's also in football. We want to play more like the Spanish team or like Barcelona, right? Playing styles. You always reference something somewhere else that is symbol for what you're talking about. So that's what interreferencing is. And think about housing estates here, what their names are, or the housing estates in mainland China, or the names that you use. I mean, it's not for nothing that in Hong Kong, almost every development, they say, well, it's in Soho. Even if it's really far away, you still say it's in Soho, because that name adds a certain value. And why is it called Soho? Because it refers to Soho somewhere else. And nobody actually really knows what Soho somewhere else even is. But it's something cool or something good. And Hong Kong is packed with all these ridiculous English names. Fairview Mansion, and it's not for nothing that those names, it doesn't have anything to do with Hong Kong, right? That's interreferencing. New solidarities, that's about the fact that Iwo Ong says, when you look at cities, cities are not only about economic development and pushing the economy, cities are also about resistance. That's what Margaret Meyer also said, right? With neoliberalism, more resistant. She's saying that also in these resistances, there's also worlding going on. These are new solidarities. So solidarities develop by contact with other places. When people feel that their government is not fair, there's context of people that protest with people in other places. And this builds solidarities between groups, which can help you actually to resist developments that you don't want. So, for instance, refugees in cities around the world. We all know that refugees have quite a hard time. If you're a refugee, you've gone away from the place where you're from because you had to go away. You don't do it for fun. And then you arrive in a spot. It's difficult. Very often refugees have contacts with each other that can help you to develop practices that work. So new solidarities is really about developing contacts with groups that can exchange information and know each other and support each other. It's a solidarity. That's the text by Iwo Ong. So for Iwo Ong, be able to reproduce the two approaches that think in linear ways about development, so political economy and subaltern studies, and be able to summarize what they say. Secondly, be able to explain what is worlding and how that's a different way of thinking, because it doesn't have a unilateral direction, but it has different directions. Thirdly, be able to mention different types of worlding practices and explain what they are. questions so far?
No. No Jack.
What about Jack Ma?
No Jack Ma. No question.
No.
No question.
Okay. Who has the power? So this is chapter, so the character of these different texts is a little bit different, and also the complexity is a little bit different. This is a text from a textbook, which it gives it a more overview character. This text is about the question who makes decisions in cities, and who can we understand it, and especially the theories about that question. Right? Well, first of all, in this text there are 4 theories. Elite theories, pluralist theories, city limits by Patterson, and regime theory. Right? You should be able to summarize the theories about who makes a decision from each of these 4. That's the first thing that you should be able to do. Then next, the first bit of the article is really about elitism versus pluralism, because that's the most classic contrast. You should be able to explain what is the difference between elitism and pluralism, and especially in the chapter they make quite a big thing about the fact that pluralism is developed by political scientists and elitism is developed by sociologists, and that they've got different methods. Sociologists look through status, and the political scientists look more behavioralist. They look at behavior, right? So you should be able to explain that. Then in the paper there's a couple of arguments what's wrong about pluralism. For instance, it mentions that maybe pluralists support some weaker groups, but it only supports them a little bit, so it's not really relevant. It talks about non-decisions. You shouldn't look at the things where the decisions are being made, because if you're going to look empirically, you need to look at things where decisions are being made. But maybe you should look at places where there's not a decision, because it doesn't become a topic. And you should be able with this text to say to have an opinion also about, if you think about a city like or either the city where you come from or a city like Hong Kong, which theory do you think makes most sense in this city and why? You should be able for these to sort of apply it a little bit. Okay, that brings us to last week. Oh no, one more, please. The chapter on Tycoon City. So basically, what this paper does is first explain how, if you look at rich people, you shouldn't see the fact that people are rich as personal capacity, but you should look at the structural reasons why inequality emerges. So it says both rich people and poor people are being produced by a system. And the funny thing is, we always tend to see poor people as a victim of a system, but rich people as always when there's documentaries, whatever, about rich people, they're always depicted as people that were really smart and managed to create a great world. Well, they're also just lucky. They just managed to be the right person at the right time. It's very structural, the fact that people get rich. So that's the first point of this chapter. And the next, so for this reason, it argues that you should look at the political economy that produces wealth. And in order to look at political economy, it looks at four things: the political system, the revenue regime, and economic and policy in Hong Kong. And it explains wealth inequality, the dramatic wealth inequality in Hong Kong, from those three things. So a political system makes sure that almost nobody can influence what happens, only a few people, and those few people are the rich people. The revenue system means that wealth is especially produced through real estate, and that it's very easy to control that development of wealth. And what was the third one? Oh. The economy and economic policy. If you look in Hong Kong at how economy functions, it's mainly based on real estate and finance, and that's a deliberate choice. And all sorts of policies that could have supported a much wider economic base, which could have spread wealth as well, have not been pursued because the people who make decisions, who are the dominant regime, you could say, are the ones, because of the political system, that's a very restricted amount of people. And this is one of the very important reasons why in Hong Kong there were so many protests about universal suffrage, obviously. Because everybody felt that if we don't have a wider access to political power, we can't influence what happens in a system, then inequality stays small and we can't influence it. So that's the first part. The first part of the paper explains wealth inequality through these characteristics of the political economy. And in that sense, this chapter is not very revolutionary. It summarizes literature that's there already. The second part of the paper discusses why, if those inequalities are so big, and if it's so clear, and everybody knows that, why is it accepted by people? Why? Because it results in a lot of unfairness. So why do people accept that? Right? So basically, the paper points at a couple of reasons why there is support for this system. First of all, there is what is called a pro-development regime, which means that in the elite groups, all the noses of everybody point in the same direction. So we've seen in the text by this text, Who Has the Power, that the argument was that in cities where economies are very diverse, there's very different interests in a city. So for instance, if you run a factory, you want your basic cost to be low. If you don't need very high education, probably. If you're in a knowledge economy, you want highly educated people. So your interests in education are very different depending on these industries. So if your city has very diverse industries, what the elites want is very diverse. So they won't agree very easily together. In Hong Kong, because that's not the case, the elites are quite aligned in the same direction. And that's pro-development. So because they're all aligned, there's also not a lot of conflict or contest from the elites. A second argument is that in Hong Kong, there are elements of an ideology that are shared by a lot of people, which is sort of a consciousness that is being educated when you're in Hong Kong. These include that in Hong Kong, if you really do your best, you can become something. The idea that in Hong Kong, Li Ka-shing is always put forward as a self-made man that started with a flower shop or with a flower factory. The image of the self-made man, everybody can become rich if you just do your best. The idea that there's high social mobility, which actually if you look at the facts is not true at all. The fact that there is high-rise and this focus on real estate is necessary because there's no space. There's a whole range of these sort of ideological positions that have helped to make people believe that this is how it has to be and that it's good. And then a third element that has helped to make people accept the situation have for a long time been social welfare systems that have taken away the worst things. There's good healthcare, there's free education, there's social housing, which of course help to appease people that have little, then you can always say, yeah, but we give you a lot. So these are the arguments where there's still a lot of support for that system, or there was a lot of support. And then the last part of the paper, when it discusses why is that support falling away, that is especially because of changes also in the real estate industry and in trans-border flows of finance, with changes in global finance and with the enormous amount of wealth generated in mainland China, that has a ridiculous impact on Hong Kong, and that has totally unbalanced the city. So this paper looks, you see these themes coming up of neoliberal urbanization in relationship to real estate, popular contest and what it explains throughout these texts. Okay, that brings us to the last two texts that we discussed last week, Monday. And these two texts are about evaluating policies. So evaluating, is this policy good, or has the government done well? So I've said that the text of Marshall McConnell is more pragmatic, and the text of Feinstein is a little bit broader. Feinstein looks more at the question, does the government do well? But you could also judge policy from the point of view of Feinstein. Now, we've looked at Marshall McConnell. Marshall McConnell started with saying that there's something wrong with evaluation literature. This literature is too much focused on, does the policy do what the government says it should do? And they call that programmatic success, one of the elements of programmatic success. But they're saying that as a criteria, that's not enough. Because, well, first of all, it's really nice that the government says that, but if that doesn't mean that the policy is good, because maybe a lot of people don't agree with what the government thinks should be the plan, for one. So to evaluate a policy only on that criteria is not good. And what Marshall McConnell also say about the evaluation literature, actually, the question, what is success, is hardly asked. So first of all, nobody really asked that question. Somehow people think it's logical, and then if they ask the question, they've got a very narrow definition of success. And then next, Marshall McConnell looked through the literature to see alternatives, and they find two sources of literature that are broader. The first one is Boyne, who has these 5 theories of success. You should be able to reproduce those 5 theories and what they are, what they mean. Next, they look at Bovis and at Hart, 2 Dutch researchers, and they say what's really good is that actually Bovis and at Hart don't only look at programmatic success, they also look at political success. And then in the remainder, Marshall McConnell themselves add actually a process success to the thing, and then they come to this scheme to judge success of a policy, right? You should be able to explain the contents of that scheme. So you should say, okay, Marshall McConnell argue that there should be 3 types of success. You should be able to say, well, Bovis and Hart said there were 2 types of success. Which one were they? You should be able to explain those contents of success. And you should be able to answer the question, if you would use the text by Marshall McConnell, how would you judge the success of a policy? Or to put it differently in terms of the course and the tutorials that we're going to do, if you're evaluating a policy with the question if it should be transferred to your client city, how would you judge if that policy was good or not? Well, if you would use Marshall McConnell, you would say, I would look at 3 aspects. I would look at programmatic success, I would look at process success, and I would look at political success. When it comes to programmatic success, I would ask this and this and this question, and so on. And then probably what I would say, the question is how. I would say, well, then it's still difficult, because maybe for one aspect it says it was successful, but for another aspect not. Right? So to show that you realize that these things can be in different directions is quite important. Now, the text of Susan Feinstein is really about the same sort of issue. How should you judge if a policy is good or not? She wouldn't use the word success, but you could, because that's too pragmatic, but you could also say, how do you judge that? And Susan Feinstein, she starts with analysis and discussion of attention for social justice in urban studies. That's really background. And then she comes to a conclusion that there's basically three sources of justice. One has to do, the liberation has to do with political justice. The second one, diversity, has to do with social justice. And the third one, equity, has to do with economic justice. So with political justice, it's about the question, is there a sort of political equality? Who has access to decision making? And I've said this is why I was a little bit skeptical of using the term democracy for this whole thing. Democracy is a model, but how is access to decision making organized? Is it a very small group of people that decides everything? Is it a big group? If it's a big group, how is access organized? Is it direct democracy or indirect democracy? There's all these sort of questions. The idea of Susan Feinstein is that if there is more political equality, meaning more people have access to decision making, that there's more justice in itself. And we've said that that's not because of content, but because it's highly likely that if the voices of everybody in decision making are being heard, it's very hard to not pay attention to those voices anymore. So being at the table, even if you can't push the decision making, but the fact that this perspective is part of the decision making will mean that it will automatically, the outcome will become more fair. That's the argument. I mean, you can disagree with that or not, but that's the argument of Susan Feinstein. And she has been doing research which shows that actually there is good reasons to believe that. Then there's the other two social justice criteria. With diversity, it's about the fact, can you be who you want to be in a city, or does that result in exclusions? Does every group have access to labor? Does every group have access to public spaces in the city? Is everybody allowed to make use of the same transportation systems? And also, actually, that relates to economic injustice. Can everybody make use of the same system? And then the last one, equity, is about economic justice, economic equality. So the question for Susan Feinstein is quite easy, is does this policy increase or decrease forms of inequality? And again, of course, then we've discussed how sometimes making inequality smaller for equity can still be more problematic for other forms of injustice. So those are the texts, and the things that I've said now, those are the things that you can expect questions about. So it's quite easy.
Not so easy.
I only needed how long? 50 minutes. No, I know it's not, yeah, I'm joking, of course. But I hope that this helps you guide the studying, because sometimes, especially with texts like the text of I Will Ong, you don't even know what's important and what's not anymore because it's so abstract, right? So I hope this helps you guide how you study and what you study. So any questions about this? Yes.
When we answer the exam questions, do we need to use some examples to illustrate the theory, or we just need to explain those things conceptually?
Yeah. So it's hard to answer that question precisely. So I'll give you my. You have to remember when you do a test, right? The audience is, in this case, me, because I'm marking, right? But you're writing a test for somebody. So of course you need to, by writing, you need to convince me that the answer that you give is the right answer, right? So if you're gonna write a test where you write an enormous long answer, and a little bit is really about what you should say, but there's much more. I get the feeling that you're not sure what the answer is. So I would try to be to the point, because that's only, if you give a really long answer and it's only 20% relevant, then I'm thinking, you're not sure, right? So being concise and to the point is good. However, while being concise and to the point, you can be too short. That's always the risk, because then it's really short, but then and then it turns out you should have said something more, which you just knew. So part of that's the downside of tests. It's really a skill. You need to know what you need to say. Not. So for instance, if you give an example to explain, so if you have to explain the difference between managerialism and entrepreneurialism, and you can give an example of a city when it was entrepreneurial and when it was managerialism. For instance, the city then did this and then did this. It's just an example. I don't think you can come up with an example for this, but as an example for you guys. Then of course that helps to show the difference, right? And you can say in words as much as you want to describe what is managerialism and what is, but if you have to explain what is managerialism, what's entrepreneurialism, first describe it and then say, for instance, policies like this and this and this would be managerial. That's also give an example. So that's precising a little bit what you mean. And then if you say, for instance, you also show that you know there's more, but then you give some examples to understand the direction to think in. That gives me the impression that you really know what you're talking about. So generally keep length in mind, but yeah, if you can add some detail to show, to convince me that you know what you're talking about, it's good. But you should not convince me about the fact that you've read the whole text. You should convince me that you can answer the question. Yeah, a little bit so for when you make a test, I really can, it's really very often that when somebody makes a test, and after you make a test, you can of course ask me to see the answers and how it's marked, that everybody has a right to do that. And then very often I will say, well, this is how it's marked. It won't change anything about your mark, but I'm happy to explain how the marking goes. But then very often it turns out that somebody actually knew the answer, but it's not on the exam paper. That's of course really, that's not so nice, because you've really been studying, you know the answer, but you did. So a lot of it is really about thinking, what does he want to hear, right? So one of the things that's really important, I would really suggest that you first, before you start answering questions, just read the whole paper. And then in answering the question, make sure that you have time in the end and read your answer and really think, does the answer the question? It's quite often that answers are just not an answer to the question. They're really nice answers, but they're not answers to the question. So just to take some time to really reflect on, and it's most of the time it's good at the end, because then it's a little while ago from writing. So just check what your answer is and think, is this an answer to the question? Right?
I have a little question.
Yes.
I want to know, to ask, can we see the test question and answer for the past few years?
No.
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 Okay.
The reason is the text. If I would give you much more text, then you could, but there's not that many texts also. So so it just doesn't make sense. So I showed you an example of a question that you can expect. I've told you what the questions will be about. Then the rest doesn't really make sense. Any other questions? If not, then I suggest that that's it for today. So again, I will make sure to check emails. I will promise that I'll respond quickly if there's questions. So if you study and you have something's not clear, just send me an email about it.
啊，写第8个，我记得东西。啊？没啊。写一块。
Everything okay?
Yeah, that's okay. I will follow that.
Okay.
I went to a language center yesterday.
Sorry?
I went to a language center yesterday.
You went to the language center?
Yeah.
How was that?
But many resources are just for undergraduate students.
They are. That's true. But most of the time, if they're not using it, you're allowed to use it also.
Yeah, but you need to set some make appointment with the staff in advance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I make schedule with the staff on next Monday some professional workshop.
Yeah. Yeah. So the workshops are not that easy. We're trying to have some organized, but they have. You can ask for using the service. You can ask for feedback, and if it's not being used, the priority is for undergraduate. But graduate students are also allowed if it's not being used.
Yeah, but all of them resources just you need to study by yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Definitely. I know.
Yeah. So that's why. Yeah, that was now.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah, because that's a tutorial in Vision about this, so I go there.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah, I think that the university could take it more serious.
But I don't know. I can meet some foreign people to improve my spoken English, some association or some club. I don't know.
No, I don't know.
Everyone don't know.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'm doing that with Thai actually. I'm meeting up with Thai people to speak Thai. And it's really helpful. So
you miss this club?
Sorry?
Language center?
No, it's outside. I just contacted Thai people. I'm learning Thai. And then just meeting up with people and speaking is also.
Yeah, I also found some information to some reading up. Do you know this activity?
What?
Reading up.
Meeting up?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe different people from the foreign country or the
that's really good.
That's really good language.
That's really good.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. So it's 7:45, which is nice and early. So I suggest that for those of you who have a tutorial, which is fun, let's start at 8 o'clock. Is that okay? So we do 15 minutes break now, and then we start at 8 o'clock. There is the list for the attendance somewhere going around. So can you make sure that your name is on the attendance list? For those who are not doing the tutorial, I won't see you next week, so I'll see you on the day of the test here. So, guys, just honestly, if you come up, because I know how this goes. Now you're sitting here, you're listening, and that, but then in a week or something, you have a question. Let me know. Okay? You have a question.
Yeah. Choose 4 articles you love most.
Choose 4 articles that I love most.
Yeah.
Oh, of these.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I'd rather not say, because then you think that's gonna influence which article I ask a question about. So there's no relationship to the article I like and the question I ask. But the article I like most, of course, is the one that I wrote myself. That's not true. I hate that. No, of these ones, I think the article of Iowa On is really awesome. The text. And really rich, but also really complex. That's what I think.
我做好了吧？
啊？
记得吧？前面都说
不对，
前面都说的都是，
主要是前面，
前面都说的都废话，
后边儿
主要是后面，
前
面说的都
面没东西。